Here is Sailor Studio 231. And as a pink, this isn't screaming at you. It is a soft pink, very gentle on the eyes. The chromatography has me thinking this is a pure pink. Now, there's almost no or none I can really see tone shift as we change the papers. It shades really nicely, always easy to find in the writing sample. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it holds strong in tone and still shades well. In fact, it performs just as well as it does on premium papers. Now, while I doubt I would get a bottle of this ink, this is a great looking pink ink. The tone of pink here just isn't calling to me.
The pen for today is a Sailor 1911 large ringless. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
We can really see that gentle mid-tone of pink here against the bright white paper of the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with easy to spot shading, because it goes from a gentle lighter pink to very dark. And it happens frequently, not like every letter back and forth, but frequently as in it's hard to find a word without some shading in it, and any word over a couple letters, you're going to see some very dark areas of shading. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Sweet Potato Purple. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Black of Score.
Here is Sailor Bungu Box Ebisu. Here is Sailor Kobe number 46 Museum Gray.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Does not feather, does not spread, does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. An example of some of the very nice shading is an example on the first line, where the E is a nice mid-tone, getting to a dark X, a lighter tone AM, the P going back to a nice mid-tone with LE at the end getting much darker. Now consider next to it, that largely goes from a lighter tones to mid-tones back to lighter to mid. None of the darker letters, still shading, very nice, always looking good. Looking at the back of the page, it's not a big deal, but I do see just two spots that it gets a little bit deeper into the page. I'm not going to call a warning sign for this. I might have paused while I was writing, causing that. Otherwise, we have no issues with bleeding, no issues with ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
We can see here that we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. This ink is unaffected by the tone of the paper, meaning the ink itself, while being a nice gentle pink lighter tone, is quite opaque and a very nice thing happening. No feather, no spread, and it shades just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. Not always too as dark. If you look at give, it's giving plenty of shading with the GI being darker than the VE, but it doesn't get that very dark letter in almost every word the way it did on the Clairfontaine. An example of seeing those darkest parts does come in example where I forgot to cross the X, but the PLE take the word from being a lighter tone, little darker at the P, much darker at the LE. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we see we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade very well, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, meaning we're not getting as many words that go all the way to the darkest version of this. Like consider is mostly light or the light and the mid-tones. We do get some of the darker tones like on false with the LSE at the end. It's there. Most importantly on this, I see this standing out with no problem against the quad rule. I kind of expected because of the tone of the ink for this to be a little visually confusing, and it is not. So if this is the type of paper that you regularly use, I think this is a great ink to use with it. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting at all. What a great ink.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more pink inks.
Here is Diamine Flamingo Pink. Here is Lavender Pinkly. Here is Platinum Pink. Here is Robert Oster Cherry Blossom.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the tone here, we can see that it is just the tiniest bit lighter, barely noticeable, really, than it was on the Clairfontaine, though we see much more of the lighter tones. No feathering, no spread. It shades nowhere near as frequently as it does on the other papers. This paper has a tendency to dull those features of inks, and that's just what's happening here. I still think it stands out against the quad rule pretty well, and if you wanted to use this as a student, I wouldn't have any problem or say stop using it. This looks great. Probably more as a second color, but it still looks great on the page. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is KWZ Iron Gall Gummy Berry. Here is Noodler's Dark Matter. Here is Thornton's Brown. Here is Califolio Grise de Pain.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is just the tiniest bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, this is copy paper, so we do tend to expect some bad things to happen. Do you know what does not happen? Bad things. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a tiny bit of shading, about the amount of shading that we saw on some of the other non-fountain pen friendly papers that do tend to be a bit better than this. Look at that right there, the that on second line. The T is lighter than the H, lightens up a little bit at the A, dark again at the T. I guess you could call that tiny feathers. I tend to be more allowing of what I call not feathering on 20-pound copy paper, because this is usually very bad. Looking at the back of the page, we can spot a couple of points that it gets a little deeper into the page. I don't see this as a big deal. I think if you were using this ink on both sides, you could comfortably write on both sides of the page without destroying both sets of notes. And quite obviously, nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Sailor 1911 Ringless has a medium flow fine nib, and this ink had me thinking it was much drier a pen than it is. The writing is a good consistent tone that shades really well. Off camera, I went for a wet medium pen to perhaps darken and alter the tone some. The wet medium did just that, but as it darkened it, it oddly took on a slightly lavender lean to it. To avoid the lavender lean from the wet pen, I think the best way to go here is a medium flow, medium or fine nib. It will deliver a good shading, consistent tones throughout all of your writing, giving you a fantastic pink.